A campaigner against wrongful convictions and former Canadian justice official says jailhouse informants are among the most dangerous of witnesses, and New Zealand should consider tightening its rules around their use. Bruce MacFarlane QC was a Canadian Crown prosecutor and former Deputy Justice Minister for the state of Manitoba, and he was involved in drafting tighter guidelines for the use of jailhouse witnesses there. In New Zealand, in 2017, one of three jailhouse informants who gave evidence against David Tamihere in his murder trial for the killing of two Swedish tourists was found guilty of multiple counts of perjury for lying at that 1990 trial. Bruce MacFarlane believes up to 2% of convictions are wrongful convictions, and while there are usually multiple causes, jailhouse informants are among the main ones.
As a whole, in very general terms, they are highly unreliable, almost to the point of being dangerous. They have been characterized as the most dangerous witness that ever goes near a courthouse.
Why? Why are they the most dangerous?
Because they were in jail at the time that they say they received a confession from the accused person. So they're in jail for a reason. They're criminals. They often have serious criminal records. They don't want to be in jail, and they'll do almost anything to get out. So they will literally put up their hands and say, you know, that fellow made a confession to me. So if you're interested in having that, let's sit down and see if we can make a deal here. And often they've simply made up the confession. It didn't take place, but that's their ticket out.
Obviously, we have had a number of high-profile cases in New Zealand where we have used jailhouse informants. Should they continue to be used?
That's the $64 million question. My own view is that I'll call it the chokehold, the assessment of whether a jailhouse informant should be called should be extremely tight, almost to the point of not calling any, because they are simply dangerous, they're inherently unreliable, but there might be just a sliver of jailhouse informants that are actually telling the truth. So I'm not sure that we can turn off the tap totally. It's important to look at the rest of the evidence and to see if there's anything that confirms what they're saying. If there's nothing to confirm what they're saying, I say they should not be called at all.
So you're saying in order to use a witness, a jailhouse informant, there must be some other corroborating evidence other than their testimony. First benchmark to pass.
Yes, if their alleged confession that they received stands alone and there's nothing to confirm the truth of what they're saying, and the rest of the case doesn't confirm it, in my view, it's far too dangerous to call that evidence, and the prosecution ought not to call it.
So you were involved in developing some more stringent guidelines for using jailhouse informants, and these guidelines were for Manitoba in Canada. One of the things you came up with that only one of these kinds of witnesses should be used in any particular case. There is a very high-profile case in New Zealand, the David Tamihere murder trial. There were three jailhouse informants used in that case. There's others where multiple jailhouse informants have been used. What do you think of that practice? Well,
I know one of the cases in Canada, I'll start with a Canadian example. In one of the cases in Canada, it was high profile, it was a terrible crime, and 11 jailhouse informants put up their hand and said, he confessed to me. And then the prosecution whittled it down to 3, one of whom had been previously convicted for perjury, and they were called. Public inquiry was called when it was found that the person was innocent, and the commissioner, who is a retired judge of the Supreme Court of Canada, made the recommendation that if you're going to call a jailhouse informant, call no more than one, because they're inherently unreliable, and if you call 2 or 3, it sort of looks like inherently unreliable evidence is good evidence, and in fact it's not. So in my view, when we developed that policy, it was thought if the prosecution is going to call a jailhouse informant, it should be a maximum of 1, and the jury should focus on that individual alone and assess whether or not he or she is telling the truth. But it's unfair to the jury to call a bunch of them when they're all unreliable.
Here's the thing though, people would say that judges instruct juries all the time about making assessments around the reliability of witnesses. When these people give evidence, the jury knows they're in jail, so why can't they be relied on to make decisions around character? Jurors aren't dumb, are they?
No, they're not, and I do believe strongly in the jury system, but a high court judge in New Zealand a number of years ago in a report to government commented on that, and he said juries are good at many things, but in his view they're not well positioned to assess whether a jailhouse informant is telling the truth because they don't understand the environment in jail. Now, some might argue, well, that could come out in cross-examination. You can illustrate the circumstances in jail and the jail environment. But that was his view, and I'm inclined to agree with that. Jurors just, they understand daily things on the outside, but the tremendous pressure to get out is not fully understood by jurors, and they might listen to the jailhouse informant and say, well, what he says makes sense, when in fact he's lying.
In New Zealand recently, there was a prosecution taken against a jailhouse informant. It was a successful prosecution. The informant was convicted of a number of counts of perjury. That started as a private prosecution. So I notice in your guidelines, one of the guidelines is that informants found to have given false evidence should be, well, chased down and prosecuted. So the Crown in New Zealand has never prosecuted an informant for perjury. What do you make of that?
Well, I would say this, that often for a jailhouse informant who's convicted, let's say, of murder and is in jail for life, they have nothing to lose. They're in jail for life. So often they will say, well, I'm going to claim I got a confession. I didn't, but it might be my ticket out. And if they find that I'm lying, what can they do? So there has to be some consequence for them. And in jail, there's not too many consequences for lying. One of them is perjury, and even that, if you get a consecutive sentence for perjury and you're in for life, does that really act as a deterrent? So my view is that you have to pull out every stop you can think of to make it clear to the jailhouse informant that if they dare lie, there will be consequences for them. But it's a tough one. They don't face many consequences. There might be some jailhouse consequences in terms of going into segregation or something of that sort, but that has to be approved by correctional authorities who are not connected to the case.
So given that you think these are some of the most dangerous witnesses possible, jailhouse informants, we seem to be using them with greater regularity than perhaps in Canada. Do we need to adopt tighter rules around this?
Well, I would paint a bigger picture for you. Jailhouse informants were called in Canada. That's virtually completely dried up. Virtually no jailhouse informants are being called at all as a result of the policy that we developed in Canada, which says generally don't call them. In the United States, they continue to be called, but that's now drying up as well. A number of states in the U.S. are developing very strict guidelines in terms of when they can be called. So to get to your question, it seems to me that New Zealand has two main options. One is to develop prosecution guidelines that are very tough in terms of when they should be called, along the lines of the guidelines that you have in your hands, Lisa. Or the other option is for government to develop legislation for the same purpose, to define the circumstances in which a jailhouse informant should be called or could be called, and make those guidelines, or not guidelines, make the legislation very tough. But I think those are two viable options for New Zealand that would achieve the objective that I think is laudable.
So are we behind with this then? When you outline what Canada's doing and even the States, are we lagging?
Well, I never like to be critical of any country, but I would say this, that when Sir Thomas Thorpe, who was a former High Court judge and a Court of Appeal judge, when he did his report, he said, now he's a New Zealander, he said, we're behind and Canada's way out in front. We should try to catch up. But that was 15 years ago. And as I say, I hate to be critical of another country, but I think it's important for New Zealand to start the discussion, to start the dialogue on this, and to realize the dangers posed by jailhouse informants. It's real and can easily lead to a miscarriage of justice.
Bruce, I just want to ask you one thing. The public register that you keep in Canada, which lists the jailhouse informants, what is the purpose of that? Is that so that you can see if an informant is regularly turning up or injecting themselves into criminal proceedings, or is it just an issue of basic transparency?
It was actually both. I wanted to make sure that the media would have access to it, that the public would have access to it, and Defence Counsel would have access to it. We wanted to signal that we're being totally transparent in this area, so anyone can get a hold of it. But as well, we thought that there should be a form of tracking of inmates that put up their hand and say someone confessed, because if they're doing that regularly, that in itself signals that there's a problem. And as Commissioner Corey said in one of the public inquiries in Canada, where the 11 people had put up their hands, he said one of them, who is one of the 3 that was called as a witness, to use Commissioner Corey's words, had claimed to receive more confessions than many dedicated priests. So I think that the public is entitled to know that, the jury's entitled to know that, and the public and Defence Counsel are entitled to know that someone is regularly claiming that they've received confessions, because that speaks volumes that they probably didn't.
And that was Bruce MacFarlane QC, and he's speaking at a wrongful conviction seminar in Christchurch this Sunday.